Aryans. When you hear that word, quite understandably, the first thing that comes to mind is a very specific leader of the Second World War and large-scale crimes committed for ethnic reasons. But Aryan, or rather the word Ārya, first recorded in Sanskrit, meaning honorable, noble, or one of us in a civilizational or social sense. Originally meant something completely different before its reinterpretation in the 18th century, for those who spoke the languages and practiced the customs of the people who, over millennia, became the true Aryans, mean far more than that to us. They were people living close to copper mines, with advanced fortifications and the best horses one could ask for. Because today we're talking about the first Aryans, the Sintashta and the Andronovo. The Sintashta lived between 2100 and 1800 BC in the southern Urals, descending from earlier Indo-European groups that already practiced metallurgy, such as the Poltavka, pastoralists and tamers of archaic horses, which looked a bit more like donkeys to be fair, and the Abachevo, from whom they inherited part of their metalwork, pottery and architecture, and indirect genetical influences from the corded ware culture, being much more related to the Yamnaya genetically. They didn't move all the way to the Urals out of curiosity, but to settle near fertile fields as well as copper mines, which greatly strengthened their metallurgy, the source of their tools and most importantly, weapons, which, judging by the frequent conflicts in the region, seemed to be quite essential. They lived in circular or oval settlements, such as Archaim and Sintashta, the site that gave them their name, built with pillar frame techniques and defensive walls up to 6 meters high. These were strategically placed on river plains, guarding mineral and food resources during periods of competition and climatic stress. The Sintashta developed advanced horse breeding and training techniques, producing strong, fast animals ideal for light chariots and riding, which will slowly spread throughout the entire world, to the point that almost every single modern horse descends from the Sintashta stock, apart from a fair amount of horses of Mongolia, which descend from those of the Botai culture from northern Kazakhstan. Their elite burials were unusually rich for the time: large metal goods, advanced weapons like spearheads and battle axes, horse harnesses, animal sacrifices, and spoke wheels, the first of this kind in the entire planet, lighter and therefore faster. Most scholars consider them the inventors of the war chariot, that is, a chariot specifically designed for light and fast combat, because the Sumerians technically had war chariots with archers 300 years earlier, though those were heavier and slower. But the only parts that have survived to this day are the wheels. Because of the presence of those wheels in warrior tombs, it is evident that they were some form of chariot associated with the warrior elite. We simply do not know exactly what they look like. Their metallurgy progressed into tin bronze, the golden looking bronze typical of all Bronze Age civilizations, though in their case, bronze alloys were more yellower and very likely to darken or redden through oxidation. Genetically, they were mixed and varied. According to reliable recent studies, the Sintashta were on average 50 to 60% Yamnaya, 20 to 30% Anatolian farmer, and the remaining 10 to 20% will either be Caucasus hunter-gatherer or Siberian depending on the individual, partially due to their contact with the Siberian people of the Amnia complex, one of humanity's earliest fortifications after Jericho. The genetic differences were strong from a side to another, so no single defined racial group to be found here. And finally, their society was a well-organized aristocracy, with clear evidence of warfare, structures destroyed and rebuilt repeatedly, seemingly due to violence. But then why am I calling them the first Aryans? Well, it's because the Sintashta are considered by many archaeologists and linguists to represent the first cultural expression of the Aryans, or Proto-Indo-Iranians, who later split into the peoples of Iran and Vedic India. This identification is not just a belief, is based on different kinds of evidence. First of all, they had light-spoke wheels, a hallmark of Indo-Iranian cultures such as the Persians, Mitanni, and the Vedic Indians, along with horse burials, bronze weapons, and fortified steppe warrior societies. Second, their funerary rituals and horse cults, including the sacrifices, match descriptions of the Vedic hymns, which refer to their ancestors using the word Ārya. That line beneath the accent mark isn't just decorative, by the way, it means a long stressed A, just like the long vowels O and A in Romanus, the Latin word for Roman. Third, although genetically mixed, the Sintashta were the most directly related to the Proto-Indo-Iranians before the Andronovo horizon. Their men mostly carried haplogroup R1a Z93, typical of later Indo-Iranian branches. They also share reconstructed words for chariots, horses, and sacrifices, later found in Sanskrit and Avestan. Also, that doesn't mean that they all spoke the same dialect. There were many tribes and accents, because the Sintashta were not a single homogeneous culture, but a group of related cultures sharing similar practices. Fourth, we know that Indo-Iranians worshipped fire as a divinity later on. This stopped being the case for Iranians with the birth of Zoroastrianism, but fire stayed as a core element of their culture, as seen in the fire of victory in the Temple of Fire of Yazd, Iran, which tradition says has burned continuously since 4070 AD, and there is also the sacred fire of the Parsis in Udvada, which was lit in 721 AD. But did the Sintashta also worship fire as a deity? At sites such as Archaim and Sintashta, archaeologists found clay and stone altars with ash, charcoal, and burned bones, sometimes human, near what might have been sacred enclosures. In Archaim, circular platforms show repeated fire use. In Sintashta, near chariot graves, there are layers of ash and animal offerings remarkably similar to Vedic fire altars described in their religious texts, the Agnihotra. These practices parallel later Indo-Iranian rituals, where fire served as the bridge between humans and gods, as in the Ashvamedha horse sacrifices, or offerings to Agni and Atar. Although we can confirm that they worshipped fire as an autonomous deity, because they had no writing, neither did the direct Andronovo descendants, evidence shows fire held a central ritual role. Thus, many scholars argue that their Sintashta and their direct descendants, the Andronovo horizon, were the first true Aryans in the original sense, the people who carried Indo-Iranian languages descending from Indo-European, horses, wheels, and chariots into South Asia and Iran, where a millennium and a half later, the Achaemenid Empire will rise. Of course, not every trait matches perfectly, and the Sintashta could have never written anything explicitly saying, "We are Aryans," but the truth seems to lie between the lines. Most of professionals in the matter agree that the Sintashta region fits best as the birthplace of the Aryan or Indo-Iranian cultural group, linguistically, genetically, and culturally. It seems they truly were the first Aryans. Towards the end of the Sintashta cultures, those of the Andronovo horizon begin to appear, and well, there were quite a few. The Petrovka culture in northern Kazakhstan, directly descended from the Sintashta, stood out for its complex fortifications and metallurgical workshops. Alakul in western Kazakhstan and the Urals consolidated the Sintashta system with standardized pottery and open settlements. Fyodorovka, reaching as far as the Yenisei River in Siberia, excelled in polished pottery and refined geometric decoration. Cherkasskul in the forest steppe of the Urals adapted the Andronovo system to the north, maintaining cultural continuity from the Fyodorovka. Mesovka, also in the Urals, combined pastoralism, agriculture, and metallurgy with a mixed Indo-European and Ugro-Finnic genetic profile. Sargari in the Central Asian steppes preserved advanced metallurgy but had simpler burials. And finally, Begazi-Dandibai in central Kazakhstan stood out for its monumental cemeteries and marked the transition into the Iron Age. Yeah, you summarized 7 different cultures in under a minute. You're welcome.
But then if they were all different cultures, what made them Andronovo?
Well, they were a proto-civilization of sorts. They share many civilizational practices, despite having an ethnic and linguistic variety. Despite regional diversity, all these cultures shared a common technological, economic and symbolic foundation. Their economy relied on mobile cattle and horse herding alongside sedentary agriculture and advanced bronze metallurgy, leveraging extensive trade networks for copper and tin, stretching from the Urals to Central Asia. Metallurgical workshops and smelting furnaces were present in all, along with standardized bronze tools and weapons. Architecturally, the settlements, whether fortified like the Sintashta or open like the Ārya, had planned housing, internal streets and drainage, evidence of complex social organization. Mobility and mastery of the horse were central to the cultural identity. The two-wheel spoke chariots, first developed at Sintashta, spread throughout the Andronovo horizon and transformed transport and warfare across Eurasia. Ritually, the symbolic importance of the horse and fire-related rites persisted throughout the system. Contracted burials and cremations reflect local diversity, yet share a common ideological backdrop of fire worship, probably linked to Indo-Iranian roots. Grave goods with elaborately decorated pottery, weapons, tools and chariot remains provide strong evidence of status and social hierarchy. The Sintashta and Andronovo horizon acted as a bridge between Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Siberia and parts of South Asia, with mutual influences giving rise to Aryan traditions. These communities forged a transcontinental network based on metallurgy, trade, and warrior culture. In short, Sintashta and Petrovka provided the initial drive, Alakul and Fyodorovka expanded the Andronovo horizon, Cherkaskul and Mesovka represent regional adaptations, and Sargari and Begazid and Dibai mark the transition to late Bronze Age practices. Together, they all form the most influential cultural system of the Eurasia of the second millennium BC. Literally, the physical and spiritual cradle of the great peoples who centuries later will explicitly call themselves Ārya. These men and women, thousands of years ago, set out from the Urals, crossing vast steppes, mighty rivers and towering mountains, carrying something no genetic study can measure: their language, traditions, ideas and values. They were the bearers of a heritage defined not by names or blood, but by something greater. Because when we say Aryan, we're not talking about a race, ethnicity, or a people boxed into a map. It never was. This word never meant ethnic discrimination, imposed hierarchies, or a justification for the worst war humanity's ever had. What it meant was virtue, respect, what is our own, the noble ones. And I don't mean noble as a social class or inherited privilege, but as a trait, as being noble, part of what Zoroastrianism later defined as being good, as opposed to being bad. Even in the oldest Buddhist scriptures, the Four Noble Truths of the Dhammapada, which record some of the core teachings of Buddha himself, use the word Ārya as an equivalent to noble in noble truth. Because being Aryan, this sounds very wrong. Okay, just bear with me. Because being Aryan is not about seeking validation in a mythical, uniform race that never existed, because you've never achieved anything else in your life. Being Aryan is moving all the way to the Urals to mine copper only so you can defend your people with weapons, migrating to unknown lands to ensure food for your descendants, sacrificing your home and possessions for a better future, teaching others the value of virtues, honesty and nobility, and above all, it is the desire of becoming better, respectable, honorable, or noble. So whoever you are, whoever you descend from, I hope you can relate to that desire. Today, in remembering these men and women, we can reinterpret this polemical word, freeing it from historical misunderstandings and horrors. The languages, culture, and genes were eventually passed to all of their Indo-Aryan and Iranian descendants, to the BMAC or Oxus civilization, northern India, Medes, Persia, Iran, Mitanni, Tajiks, Afghans, Kurds, lowland Nepalese, other Nepalese like Buddha himself, and partially the Azerbaijanis and Romani. Yes, the Roma are part Aryan. If you want to know who most closely resembles the Sintashta and Andronovo, at least physically, guess what? They're in the Central Asian lands that they migrated to. Who would have imagined? The Yagnovi, with close to 90% of genetic continuity. As you can see, they aren't a uniform ethnicity, but rather a mix. Then the Tajiks and Turkmens preserve 57% continuity, and the Scythians, who later conquered the Pontic-Caspian steppe, retained a considerable portion of Andronovo DNA. So if you want to see what the first Aryans look like, just look into the eyes of a Yagnovi. It is the closest thing left. And now, the most obvious question arises. Aren't Europeans Aryans as well? Well, just a little bit. Only a small fraction of Sintashta DNA made it into Europe, and today the only populations with a notable amount of their DNA are the Eastern Slavs and the Baltics, that is specifically Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, part of Eastern Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. And most, they carry 5 to 10% Sintashta DNA, so if they want to call themselves part Aryan, be my guest. There is also the belief that some European words derive from Aryan, like the name Ireland, which has absolutely nothing to do with that. Ireland comes from the Celtic goddess Ārya. I'm really sorry about the pronunciation of these words. Old English Ēryu land, which ended up being Ireland, and Ārya itself derives from the Proto-Celtic word Iweru, probably related to a word meaning fertile or abundant land. This in turn comes from the Indo-European Piwerian or Paywerian, meaning abundant land, rich in fat or dense. So yeah, not very related to the word Ārya, I don't think. Also, some might believe that the word art comes from Ārya. This is also quite unlikely, but let's see why people think that. Art comes from the Latin ars, or artis, which originally meant skill, technique, or dexterity. Its Indo-European root is ar or air, in the sense of to fit together or assemble, from which words like armin or order also derive. So it has no relation with the Aryans or the word Ārya, even if it sounds similar. So no Aryans nor any Ārya related words in ancient Europe. Europeans only began calling themselves Aryans when some 18th century writers got carried away with pseudoscience, misinterpreting the meaning of Ārya. The desire of many European populations to identify with the Aryans has different reasons to be. It was very common in Germany in the past, a culture that has always tried to give itself a civilizational and glorious origin, especially during the Second World War. Germany's allies had different ways of glorifying their past. For example, Italy had the Roman Empire to romanticize. But what ancient civilization did Germany have? None. And that, my friend, is one of the many reasons for the existence of myths such as the National Socialist perception of Hyperborea, Agartha, or Thule, giving the Germans a very glorious origin. There's also the National Socialist Aryan myth, the idea that the Aryans were a superior race and that the Germans had preserved their DNA the most. And I love the irony that technically the Slavs that they discriminated so much actually had more DNA from the real Aryans than the Germans do. It's almost poetic. Many people in the United States of America, especially in the past, were and are big fans of this too. They try to give themselves an excuse of being superior and better To legitimize their presence as a culture or group, and in case it needs to be said, I'm not referring to contemporary Americans, but to their ancestors who were immigrants on a land that wasn't theirs, coming from across the sea. And you might say, oh, but they brought civilization. Bringing civilization does not justify the genocide of thousands upon thousands of the original inhabitants of the fragging land that you settled on. When it is better to use let go and understand that your ancestors might have done bad stuff, but you are not your ancestors. You are you, born and raised in the country that doesn't need to know what the heck is a kilometer. And the situation is similar in Australia and many other places. But no, Aryans refer to the Proto-Indo-Iranians, Indo-Iranian populations and their descendants, Persians, Tajiks, Yagnobi, Kurds, Romani, etc. Thank you very much for watching, and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. It's been a pleasure. As always. Ciao!
Ba 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 ba